manipulate the system in your favour?
We had a few ideas.
Okay, far away.
First of all, you can imagine that you could set up a group consultation by having 4 people, one after the other, and they all, by coincidence, being in the same room for an hour. but the GPs on my table were uncertain if it actually was legal. You had obviously issues about consent of the people there and these rules. And there was a sense that also because of other parts of the solution, which basically points towards a need of some kind of health connector, coordinator.
Yeah,
we would probably need some funding for something like that.
Definitely.
And so both in order to get the sort of legal clarity and legal leeway, and to get that extra resource, defining it as a research project in some way, funded by national authorities. I guess that's a key part of the solutions we found.
So, do you get how do you get paid? What's the funding system? How does that work? Do you have a code that you enter for a particular activity? And so, for that particular activity, does that code has it got specific things that you need to do in that code? Okay, so and does it matter if you do those things or whether it's somebody in the practice who does them?
Yeah, for someone,
Okay, so if you took diabetes, for example, do you have a code for lifestyle advice? Well, that's definitely a code that you could click. As long as, if you imagine you had 10 or 15 people who were there for like an hour and a quarter and you spent, I don't know, a few minutes with each of them and you did the things to tick the code, you can make sure that all the other stuff gets done.
But I'm not sure. I think it has to be in one-to-one setting. I'm not sure.
So you just drag people out of the group.
Yeah.
So you just, when they're there, you grab them out of the group, you do the minimum necessary to get the code and send them back into the group.
Yeah, that could be a way of doing it.
It's what happens in the US. So I've got a colleague who has, I'll come to you in a minute, he set up group consultations and he did it by looking at what was required for the codes for the things that get paid for, and then seeing how much of that can be done by groups and how much of it has to be done by healthcare professionals, and then working out to minimise the input of the healthcare professionals and making the charging, but then also getting the group consultation so that you free up the space that you need to be able to do your job properly.
There are helper codes for group rehabilitation classes that can be used. So I don't think there's no hindrance to run groups in the practice. But yeah, we discussed before that the hindrance is maybe more so with individual patient, their expectations. It's kind of like the way we've set up our society is that everyone's entitled to see the doctor one-to-one or the therapist one-to-one, and that is the expectation. And then it's kind of like to get that communal push to say, no, I'm sorry, that's not on offer here, but this group is on offer because we think that's better for you. Evidence says it's better for you. It'll help get your loneliness, and it's more effective treatment. But there's, I think it's got to do with attitudes.
I mean, I think the same problem exists in the UK, and it's very much to do with the nature of the consultation between the health professional and the patient. And so it's one of the things you have to figure out is how do you have that consultation. You know, when you come to, so for example, if somebody's got a chronic disease that, so you have your one-to-one consultation, and somebody's been diagnosed with a chronic disease, you say, okay, look, what's the best way of managing this? And then you can start to have a conversation about groups. And then you can say, look, you know, we know that the best way of managing your disease is through a group, through other people, and I guarantee that if you say you're going to meet up with other people suffering the same experience, the patients will say, yes, I want to do that. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. And what will happen is they will be happier and healthier, and they will not come to your practice so much.
But they also say that they have more than enough handling themselves. It's too much taking in other people with the same problems.
I've got a clip. So I'll tell you the story of Kathy. It's in the Compassion Project. I wrote a book about all of this called the Compassion Project. Kathy is a person who lives in Frome, who she was a personnel manager, a kind of high-flying business person in a big company. And she lived on an estate in Frome, in a house, got 2 kids and a dog. Got a dog, remember? That's important. She got diagnosed with acute rheumatoid arthritis, and it was a really severe form of acute rheumatoid arthritis. And she was put in a wheelchair in 3 weeks, and her life totally fell apart. She went from this active, dynamic woman, walked her dog every morning for an hour before she went to work. She didn't really know her neighbours that well because she was so focused on her family and her kids. Probably not unlike what goes on here. And she was devastated. And she went to the GP and said, you know, I just need to meet some other people. I need a sense of hope. I need to meet other people who are going through or have been through what I've been through. And a GP said, well, I don't know of anything in particular, but I do know somebody who can help. So the GP put her in contact with Rose, who is a health connector. And by this time, Kathy's in a wheelchair and had to go to the GP practice in the wheelchair. So Rose said, I'll tell you what, I'll come to your house. So Rose went to her house and then had a conversation with Kathy, and Kathy was in floods of tears because she just thought, where is my life going to go? It's all disappeared. And Rose said, well, why don't you go in the first instance? We've got a group in the practice which is a self-management group. So Kathy went to the self-management group, and she walks in and she gets greeted by all these people who are so sympathetic because they've suffered like she's suffering. And they welcome her in with the warmth of their heart. And she does a 6-week self-management group, and then she goes, I tell you what, I'm going to do the pain group because I suffer a lot of pain. So she does the pain group, which again, the people in the pain group welcome her with the warmth of their heart. And she learns how to manage her pain. And then she goes, I think I'm going to do the exercise group because I've lost so much muscle. So she does the exercise group. And then she goes, I think I'm going to do the exercise group in the community because all this has been in the medical centre and I want to get out into the community. So she goes into the community. And then she goes, I think I want to become a community connector because I have benefited so much from the experience of going through those groups. I want to let other people know about it. And when you talk to Kathy, she says, I have made friends like I never knew I could. I know that they are there for me and I'm there for them. And her life is transformed by the experience. She knows her neighbours and her neighbours are now friends. She knows people in the community. And she's vocal in and active in promoting the Froome model. And her life is transformed. And I guarantee that the same would happen with your patients. I guarantee it. If you say you can meet other people who are going through similar problems, they will gallop to those groups. Guaranteed. And the reason is that you can talk to other people who are experiencing those things in ways that you can't do with health professions. And I'll tell you something else as well. In terms of bereavement, setting up community bereavement groups is the most powerful, effective and therapeutic thing you can do for people who are suffering from bereavement. Very simple bereavement cafe. I've written a blog about this actually in the British Medical Journal, supported in palliative care. You've seen it. Somebody's nodding their head. You've seen it? The blog? Okay, I'll just I can show you briefly so you can look at it, because it describes this process quite well. Okay, so this is it. I'll send you the link for it so you can read it. But it talks about the role of groups. We had a good discussion yesterday about the loss of community sources of bereavement, with the impact of bereavement counsellors and the professionalisation of care. And you can have a look at that and have a read of it. But also on Survivor of the Kindest podcast, if you go to the Compassionate Communities UK website, I've interviewed a number of people. There you'll see Steve Cole, who we heard from earlier. New Normal, Ben and Jack, two young men in the community who've been running community bereavement groups. Amber Jeffrey, a young black woman who lost her mum, runs a fantastic bereavement podcast called The Grief Gang, just fantastic. Before this, Jane Harris and Jimmy Edmonds talking about losing their son Joshua at the age of 22, killed in a road accident in Vietnam, and their grief journey and the things that they do around grief and the support that they can give. This stuff is so powerful, and when you hear people talk about this, they're talking about how they can talk to people in groups in ways that they can't talk to family members. And you think about how many people suffer from grief, and how long does grief last? Our whole lives. And these issues go largely unaddressed. And the interesting thing is that bereavement counsellors aren't even the best form of support. It's amazing. Deprofessionalisation of care. Anyway, so look, the thing about, like, we've come together in a group and we've discussed ideas, and ideas arise from having a group of people, and you're thinking about possibilities about the way that you do things, and the nature of the discussion is really important. And you can find solutions if you come together as a group and work it out. And that was the point I was trying to make. And you may not even find the solution today, but you'll for sure, you carry on the conversation, you'll find other solutions. Because people are really imaginative, and the more conversation you have, the more people you have, the more imagination you have at your fingertips. The more imagination you have. One person's imagination is outmatched by 2 people, by 10 people. And you get all of that imagination together, you'll come up with solutions, and that's the point, really. Okay, so the next thing is, like, you can think that there are 3 levels of action in terms of if you're assessing somebody's social relationships. You can do one of 3 things. Now, we talked yesterday about setting up a service directory of the community treasures, so that if you're in your GP practice or wherever you are, you're seeing a patient, and you've got this web-based directory, you can, during the conversation, somebody might say, I like walking, or I like kite flying, or I like walking dogs, or I like knitting, whatever it is. And you can go, well, funny enough, there's a group out in the community that do that, and I can put you in touch with them if you were interested in that. And for some people that works really well, but for other people that doesn't work so well, because they say, look, you know, I'm ill, I'm depressed, I don't have the energy, I don't even know what it is I want to do, so I can't possibly do, I don't have the confidence. So they go, oh, I tell you what, why don't you go and see the health connector? And then the health connector like Rose, and the health connector will come and have a chat with you, kind of figure out what it is that what you like doing, what you want to do, what your goals are. And then even like if you really feel like you can't make it to the group, the health connector will go to a group with you for the first one, for example, so that you can have the confidence. So one of the things that happens is they started a talking cafe in the community, because some people don't want to go to groups, they just want to talk, they just want to talk to people. So go down to Cheese and Grain on a Monday morning, and you'll find other people, you can talk to them. One of the health connectors will be down there, and community connectors will be down there, and it's just a friendly face, so the person goes down there. And then there's Patrick who runs the men's shed, goes to the talking cafe, and this person who there has a chat with Patrick, and Patrick tells him about the men's shed, and says, why don't you come along? And it's a man this time, but there's a women's shed as well, you know, which is quite all right. And the man says, well, are you going to be there, Patrick? And then Patrick says, yeah, I'll be there. So why don't you come along next Wednesday? So he comes along next Wednesday and walks through the door and goes, hi, Patrick. So he already knows somebody's name. And then he's welcomed into the shed, and of course the people in the shed are incredibly welcoming. And the stories you hear about the transformation in people's lives as a consequence of being in the shed is fantastic. I'll tell you another story. I like stories. Okay, I like stories. Stories are really good. Let's get this one up. Oh, this is what we were talking about yesterday. This is a picture of the men's shed, and there was a guy down the shed who said, "I want to build a coffin." So the men in the shed helped him build his coffin, and of course, when you can imagine the conversations through building the coffin, and people start talking about their advanced care plan, and you know where they like to die and all that kind of rubbish. You know, the conversations naturally take place. Anyway, so they build the coffin, and the guy who built the coffin, he's all right for a while, but he loves the shed. The guy who builds the coffin, and you can see Julie in there. Julie is the health connector, the one who's kind of does stuff in particular related to end of life care. That's Julie there in the middle, so they build the coffin, and then eventually this guy dies, and Patrick, who runs the shed, goes round to the house and sees the son, and he says, "Do you know when we were building the coffin, your dad said he'd like to be buried in the overall suit that he wore to the shed. And his son says, don't worry, I know that, and he's going to be in his special men's shed coffin. And of course people from the shed go to the funeral, and you can just see how these things naturally evolve and grow. And you haven't had to have a conversation about advanced care planning or dealing with your death or talking about death because the thing arose in the context of love, laughter and friendship. So to go back to where we were, it's all right, we can jump from one to the other, is that you may need help to get down the men's shed. And the way you set up your community infrastructure will help that, all the stuff we talked about yesterday. And then the third level is what we talked about this morning, which is exploring people's own personal networks to see how they can help out. So the 93-year-old woman who lives on the 4th floor, who's isolated and lonely, and yet has got 4 children in the community that she doesn't want to bother. Back in her residence where she is, on the 1st floor, there is a choir, and she really wants to join the choir because she loves choirs. So the Health Connector arranges for the sons to pick her up and take her down the stairs so she can join the choir. And that way you find that there are ways of engaging with family members and friends to start building these networks of resource. You know, it's a bit of a skill doing that, but you'll learn how to do it anyway. So what you're looking at is doing it for every patient, is making sure that on your clinical record, not only have you got that information, but you look at that information and you use it, and you use it like this. This is your therapeutic intervention. This is, you need a trail in the same way that you treat high blood pressure, to know that you assess the social relationships. You've put forward a treatment plan to improve people's social relationships, and you follow up to make sure that people are better. It's a medical model of management that we all understand. You make a diagnosis, you might do screening, you make a diagnosis, you prescribe a treatment plan, and you see if that plan is working. We're all familiar with that, that's not anything new. We're just using social relationships to do that. With regard to the infrastructure that you need within the GP practice, you can think that there are 4 key stages, 4 things that you need. The first thing is about what we talked about, the social relationships, identifying those in need of support. And one of the things that happens in the UK is, you know, you get these bloody awful databases, and you go, oh, we've got everything is coded, so we'll just go and look up the codes and we'll find everyone aged over 60 who's got 3 or more chronic diseases, and it's rubbish. The information you get out of that has nothing to do with people's social relationships. So your screening has got to be the most sensitive tool that you have for screening is you. You know instantly when somebody walks through the door whether they're suffering with isolation and loneliness. You know because you grew up as a human being, and as you were growing up as a human being, you devoted your time to understanding social relationships because you knew as a child that that was vitally important, and you're really sensitive to blinks of the eye, small body movements. It changes in voice tone, cough, the way that people stand. You are incredibly sensitive. You know the moment whether somebody walks through the door. You can't even tell that much from online. It's much harder, even through Zoom or but when you do it face to face, you know. And the next thing is to do goal setting is to do what is it that you would like to do, and then the next stage is those 3 levels of care, including linkage to community resource. And what is the infrastructure you need inside the GP practice? Well, you need to create internal hubs, because if you're thinking about how are you going to make sure that everything that needs to be done actually gets done? So quality improvement methodology is about systems reliability as well as being participatory. Okay, so are any of you aware of sepsis 6? Anyone know what sepsis 6 is? Okay, so sepsis is when somebody has a bacterial infection where they are at risk of dying. It's where the infection has spread to the blood. They have a bacteremia. So with sepsis, that we know that that every hour you delay in doing the 2 basic things to treat sepsis, which is giving intravenous antibiotics and intravenous fluids, every hour you delay increases mortality. It's definitely a medical emergency. So when I was doing, I was a palliative care physician. I spent half my time in the hospital, half in the hospice. But I had quite a lot to do with a variety of other things, including being part of the hub for quality improvement. And so we were teaching the junior doctors about quality improvement, and we had these junior doctors come in and we talked to them about the principles, and then we said, well, what are the things that really drive you mad? What are the things that irritate you most of all about the practice in medicine, in the practice of what's going on in the hospital? And this nice Scottish doctor said, treatment of sepsis, it drives me nuts. To make a diagnosis of sepsis, you have to measure blood lactate levels. And in order to measure blood lactate levels, you have to take the blood sample up to the blood gas machine that's up in the intensive care unit. But the only thing is there's often a queue of people who want to use the blood lactate, use the machine up in the intensive care unit, and you might have to wait 15 minutes in the queue. And worse still is that the machine goes through regular cleaning cycles, which themselves take 15 minutes. So what happens is that sometimes you don't even bother to measure the lactate. And sometimes you're trying to fit it in a really busy job and you can't fit it in and you have to wait there, and you sat there for half an hour waiting for this rotten machine to be available. And of course, then you have to figure out, okay, well, how are you going to make a diagnosis of sepsis? How are you going to know to put the intravenous fluids in? And how are you going to know that you've got to give the intravenous antibiotics within an hour? And when you've got those kind of delays, you can see mortality goes up. So we said, don't worry, we'll talk to the biochemistry department and say, well, what would it cost to convert the machine in the emergency department so it can measure blood lactate levels? So we went to the biochemistry department and they said, we tried to do this about 2 years ago. It cost about £3,000, which is, I think, more or less 30,000 kroner, something like that. And it took a few months to go through the hospital committees, and they said no. Nuts. So the point about this is you've got 6 steps. Sepsis 6. And you have to make sure that those 6 steps, which are simple to do, happen reliably every time. Every time. And what you do with the quality improvement methodology is build systems reliability. So I'll just give you like 6 steps. Let's say that each step is reliable 9 times out of 10. By the time you get to step 6, if all of them are reliable 9 times out of 10, your total process is reliable 54% of the time, which means people will die. So you have to make sure that each step has very high reliability. And the methodology from this comes from aeroplanes, from the air industry, because you can imagine on an aeroplane, modern airplanes have got about 4 million components in them, and each one has to be highly reliable. And then so that you have to include, in addition, human factors, which is a really important part of patient safety, because if the pilot is drunk and goes to sleep, then that's no good. Or if the pilot is distracted because there's other stuff going on, or if the pilot is tired, or whatever it is, or if the pilot is reluctant to report a fault even though that fault hasn't caused a problem, then those things accumulate. So the quality improvement methodology is a way of implementing high system reliability. So when you're thinking about your internal hubs, you want to be sure that all of your patients are having the things that are done for them that are really necessary. And in addition, for your complex patients, you want to have multidisciplinary team meetings. Do you have those now?
Not on a regular basis.
Not on a regular basis. It means who attends your multidisciplinary team meetings? So who would turn up typically to your multidisciplinary meeting?
It depends on the patient. I mean, it's arranged around the patient.
Okay.
It's not something we do without the patient.
So not every week?
No.
Okay. And your palliative care team, do you attend the GP surgery for your multidisciplinary meeting? No. Complex patients. So one of the infrastructure you have to build for your mental health patients, do you attend the GP surgery? Sometimes. Okay. You start to build these multidisciplinary meetings because the more heads you have to have input into complex patients, then the more likely you're going to come up with different solutions. And in particular, we'll talk about this in a minute, the health connector, who is also a community development worker, needs to be part of those meetings, because you need the stories to come back from how people's lives have changed as a consequence of the interventions that take place in the community. Because if you hear the stories, you will be strongly motivated to put other people through that process. And the whole thing about the multidisciplinary team meeting is you break down organisational silos. Like in England, what you have is you have a wide variety of different services. Might be social services, might be rehabilitation, might be physiotherapy, might be diabetes nurse, might be palliative care nurse, might be mental health nurse. They're all working within the context of aging care. They're all working in their own little environments without connecting it all up together. And in your, have you got, where's your main hospital where people are treated here?
It's about 1 hour east of Oslo.
In east of Oslo? Okay. So what happens when you have a complex patient who's got a number of diseases that needs to be discharged home? How does that work?
The doctors and nurses at the hospital, they are obliged to make an assessment of how the patient is functioning, and then they make a plan. and after that we take over.
How often does that go wrong?
Very often.
Okay. How well do the doctors in the hospital know the domestic circumstances of the patient?
Very rare.
Go on.
But we have something, I don't know if that's just for mental health, but we have something called individual plan. So when someone's got lots of different services, then you have a meeting with all of them, and so that would be the multidisciplinary meeting, and you have a plan that the patient owns as well, and everyone has responsibilities within that. So that would be something that, and then you also collaborate with the specialist service that would be in Aarhus.
Is that for mental health or for
I
in
don't know.
general?
I only work in mental health, but I'm sure it's for physical health too.
Very few persons have a personal plan.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they have a right to.
Yeah, so you know, you've used two words there. You've said oblige and you've said right.
Yeah.
Those two words are not really coming from people's hearts, are they? Okay, so you're thinking about how do you break down the organisational silos, because they are a disaster, because experience doesn't happen in silos. All right, we were talking yesterday about the definition of compassion, you know, because our compassionate communities, we need to define compassion. And it's as though you can go, we've got a special little box inside us that is the compassion box. And if the compassion box is switched on, everything is okay. But actually, we don't function like that at all as human beings. We are interdependent beings. We've got a massive amount of internal interdependencies as well as external ones. If you think about a cell, how a cell functions, it's got hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions going on every day. And that there isn't a command and control structure that says this is what, all right, this is the order, this is what you're going to do next. There's somebody, some great leader pointing out all the things that the cell has got to do. One special molecule has got all the power in its hand. And that special molecule, trust me, they went to public school and were separated from their mum at the age of 6. But instead what you've got is this interdependent network where things are constantly reacting with each other. And so that the idea that you can kind of separate human beings off into these neat little packets is completely wrong, and yet our services are designed like that. Our services are contained in buildings, in these neat little structures, and we have to dissolve the walls and have communication. And it's highly possible these days to run multidisciplinary meetings using things like Zoom, so that you don't have travel time, and that people can join in at the moment where they need to join in. But you break down the organisational silo. So when you're thinking about, okay, who do you discuss at the multidisciplinary meeting? Who organises it? Who checks that the care plan is done? Who's going to check the follow-up to make sure that the treatment plan that you have given somebody to deal with their social relationships gets followed up and actually happens? So you need a hub, and you need an admin person in the hub to be able to manage all of that. And we've worked out how many people you need per 10,000 of population. We've worked out all the figures that you need to be able to put this together, and that you can definitely work across GP surgeries, because if you've got a small surgery, you haven't got enough to employ somebody whole time. So you can employ people part-time. And if you look at, so for example, how many health connectors and community development workers do you need? Well, you need, if you've got a population of 20,000, which is more or less your population on Nesodden, then you need two community development worker health connectors. You need one about every 10,000 of population. But those people can work across different boundaries, and their job, and we're going to talk about community development in a minute so you can understand what that is. Their job is to be part of the clinical team, as well as to do the work in the community. Do you have health coaches here? No, good. Thank goodness for that. They're a nuisance. Anyway, so health connectors are people who are trained in motivational interviewing. People who know, they're not health professionals, they're good people who have good listening skills and know how to have a conversation with somebody. Good people, good, kind, caring, compassionate people. So the three things that you need more or less is the internal hub inside your GP practice. So we know that for a population of 10,000 people you need about half a full-time equivalent of admin support to be able to manage that. So you would want in Nesodden more or less just purely in admin time, you'd want probably a full-time admin person for it. And you have to figure out about, so there's a bit about, we know that because you're thinking about assessing people, about their social relationships, we know a critical time is the time where somebody comes home from hospital. And you may do this already, but you can arrange it so that on hospital discharge, there's a phone call that takes place from the practice to make sure that the person is all right. And while you're talking to the person with the illness, you're also talking to having a listen out for the carers, and you start to think about what is it the carers need as well, because by and large, the experience of being in hospital is depersonalising, and that people don't like it. And they would really rather not doing it again, thank you very much, even if it went well. And often the experience of hospital is traumatic and things go wrong because of lack of quality improvement methodology. Things go wrong anyway. And so that it's a good moment for getting behaviour change. And so you have to figure out who's going to make the phone call in the practice so it's done reliably 100% of the time. So the admin support is really critical. And then you need extra nurse time because a nurse has input in the multidisciplinary setting. And sometimes the nurses is the person who make the phone calls out to the patients when they're discharged from hospital. And likewise, you need about half a full-time equivalent nurse for 10,000 population. And so that you can figure out exactly, you can map out what you've already got and you can map out what else you need to give you an idea of the costs of the extra bit that you need to add in to make this possible. And interestingly, on the evening that I arrived here, which was Wednesday evening, I gave a talk and I met Meta and Nick. Do you know what their surnames are?
Mette Kallager.
Okay. They are professors who work in research in Oslo. And they were suggesting that the best way of funding this is to do it as through a research grant. That it's highly possible to get research money for this. And that in addition that the research money might last for something like 3 to 5 years. So you really get a chance to fully implement this and you can see whether it's working or not. So you can solve the funding issues by, and at the end of the day, if you remember, there were 3 things that we said were our main outcome measures. One is improved patient care. The second one is improved working life for clinicians. And the third one is reduced cost. And in particular, if you're approaching the government for reduced cost, the only thing they'll really hear is reduced cost. They'll think the other things are nice, but they actually don't care that much about that because they've been cutting services forever, which has been making patient outcomes worse. But so if you don't go with, if you're talking to government, you're talking reduced cost first, they will really listen. So it is possible, this is what I'm saying about creativity, about getting people together and having a conversation. It is possible to find solutions in problems that you thought were overwhelming. There is a way of doing this. Okay.
Can I just ask a question about how you described the needs in the primary healthcare sector in Nesodden for this model would be about 1 full-time equivalent administrative staff and about one nurse.
More or less.
More or less.
Yeah.
But you think it could be so these 2 people serving 5 different GP practices?
Yeah, you could do it like that. Can be. Or maybe you do 2 part-time jobs. Split them up. You need GP time as well. You need about 1 session a week for GPs to have input into this to make sure it all functions. You need to put together an implementation team inside each practice. You train up a group, put an implementation in. People in the implementation are trained up and take responsibility for driving the change inside the practice. It's all highly possible, and you use your improvement methodology to track changes over time to make sure you're getting the outcomes that you want. And Meta and Nick were saying that it's quite easy to access the data from the health record, which means that you can track what happens to healthcare usage, so you can see that healthcare usage goes down. It's all highly possible. You know, you have, and if you combine that with the community aspect of what you're doing, you know, with the building compassionate communities that we talked about yesterday, you can put a full model together. And we've learned through bitter experience that there are 7 key points. And the first thing is that surprise, surprise, working relationships come first. Trying to get clinical teams to do anything without first developing relationships doesn't work. So yet another disaster of top-down management. Top-down management is top-down management is largely it's sometimes called birdship management. Because you're constantly looking up to look at the crap that's about to land on your head coming from above. It's not the most conducive way of building support for change. So that the building relationships has to come first, and all we've spoken about. You build relationships, you build trust, you build safety. You build belonging, you allow the whole brain to come into function. You build imagination and creativity. The second point is we know that if you want to successfully implement, get the changes in healthcare, you have to implement the whole model. So that means that if you only implement only half the people who could get the benefit they need to be able to get your whole population changes are going to get that benefit, and half are not, and you don't get the health outcomes that you would want. It goes, I'll take you back to the sepsis 6 example. If it's only reliable 50% of the time, people die. You have to build in that high patient reliability. The third thing is that the methodology has to be participatory. In other words, the people who do the work are the people who understand the working patterns. The change has to come from the ground up. There's a great story. I think we've got time to show it. I think it's time to show Ernesto Ciroli.
Yes.
Yeah. This is such a great story. So we're going to show this clip. It's only a few minutes, but it is the perfect demonstration of the impact of things not coming from the ground up.
Everything I do and everything I do professionally, my life has been shaped by 7 years of work as a young man in Africa. From 1971 to 1977, I look young, but I'm not. I worked in Zambia, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Algeria, Somalia, in projects of technical cooperation with African countries. I worked for an Italian NGO, and every single project that we set up in Africa failed. And I was distraught. I thought, age 21, that we Italians were good people and we were doing good work in Africa. Instead, everything we touched, we killed. Our first project, the one that has inspired my first book, Ripples from the Zambezi, was a project where we Italians decided to teach Zambian people how to grow food. So we arrived there with Italian seeds in southern Zambia, in this absolutely magnificent valley, going down to the Zambezi River, and we taught the local people how to grow Italian tomatoes and zucchini. And of course the local people had absolutely no interest in doing that, so we paid them to come and work, and sometimes they would show up. And we were amazed that the local people in such fertile valley would not have any agriculture. And, but instead of asking them how come they were not growing anything, we simply said, thank God we're here. Just in the nick of time to save the Zambian people from starvation. And of course, everything in Africa grew beautifully, and we had these magnificent tomatoes. In Italy, a tomato would grow to this size, in Zambia to this size. And we could not believe. And we were telling the Zambians, look how easy agriculture is. When the tomatoes were nice and ripe and red, overnight, some 200 hippos came out from the river and they ate everything. And we said to the Zambians, my God, the hippos! And the Zambia said, yes, that's why we have no agriculture here. Why didn't you tell us? You never asked. I thought it was only us Italians blundering around Africa, but then I saw what the Americans were doing, what the English were doing, what the French were doing, and after seeing what they were doing, I became quite proud of our project in Zambia, because you see, at least we fed the hippos. You should see the rubbish. You should see the rubbish that we have bestowed on unsuspecting African people. You want to read the book? Read Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, Zambian woman economist. The book was published in 2009. We, Western donor country, have given the African continent $2 trillion American in the last 50 years. I'm not going to tell you the damage that the money has done. Just go and read her book. Read it from an African woman, the damage that we have done.
So I think, like, we showed this yesterday, and it got an enthusiastic reception. And the point that that he makes is so clear. Is that if you have top-down implementation, what you do is you grow tomatoes for hippos. And it's really good, it's such a kind of levelling phrase, that one. Is it, you have to ask about, if you're implementing change, is what you're doing growing tomatoes for hippos? In other words, are you really asking the people who have the experiences about what it is they can do, what is the change that's important for them, rather than making assumptions about that change? It's absolutely critical, because the further you are away from the further decision makers are, we talked about subsidiarity, the more of a disaster you implement. So that change has to come directly from the people who are doing the work, the people who are experiencing the outcomes of change. And that means you actually have to ask your patients as well, believe it or not. It means that when you're implementing change, you have to check to say, did this make things better for you? And you have to fit that into your working practices. You have to. And you have to define what better means. Do you have key performance indicators here? Is that something that you're familiar with? As like the government says you do these things, and you do those things, and they say that's a success because you did the things that we said you were supposed to do. The NHS is full of that. They're called key performance indicators, and like I was saying, keep people institutionalised. Stop people thinking about what matters most. So that it's kind of like patient-reported outcome measures. Have you come across that, PROMs? Is that something that's part of your terminology? You want to make sure that the experience that your patients have are ones that they really value, so you ask them about it. But it has to fit into your working lives. So with regard to your patients who say they want the one-to-one appointments, you would be checking to say, well, we've sent you to these groups, did these groups help? And if you're in the context of improvement methodology, if they go, no, the groups were rubbish, and then you go, well, what could we do to improve the groups? And so you would then start to get ideas from the patients to understand what it is that the things that would help to make the groups flourish. Or even better, you would ask, what was a group like? And they went, it went really, really well. It was great. My life is transformed, like Kathy. And you would go, well, what was it that made so much difference? And then they would tell you about all the great things that happened in the groups, because the lessons that you learned from the person undergoing the experience will inform other groups. So that what you build with the improvement methodology is continuous improvement. So maybe in your sepsis cycle you fix it for 60%, then 70%, then 80%, then 90% with each testing cycle, so that you build the system's reliability in all stages of it. And you make sure that your outcome measures change. And when we dealt with the sepsis problem, so who was the oncology nurse here? One of you was the oncology nurse. Okay. Do you have a problem with chemotherapy-induced sepsis? So people have chemotherapy, depresses their immune function, they get overwhelming sepsis and die. It happens. We reduced that to 0 in our hospital through the early management of sepsis. 1 year we had 13 people die from chemotherapy-induced sepsis. That went down to 0. So it's possible that when you build high systems reliability, that you can make a dramatic difference to patient outcomes. Okay, so ownership of change has to be contained within the working practice. As we talked about, you can't use databases for identifying people. You use this incredibly sensitive system you have, which is yourself, for identifying people who are in need of support. And do what's best for the patient, because so much of the stuff that we do is not necessarily best for the patient. It's for the system to say, yeah, we're doing what we think is right. So you have to take a step back and go, what's best for this patient? And then always use quality improvement methodology for change, and then community development work as part of the clinical team. And the interesting thing about the community development worker is that community development is a participatory methodology. It's from the ground up. It's somebody who knows how to build communities, go out into communities, is a good listener, can hear and understand what's going on in the community, knows how to stimulate conversations, and helps to build ideas as those ideas grow from the community up. So community development worker would have asked the farmers in the Zambezi about what works well. They would have said, what works well in your farming? And what can we do that would make it work better? Whereas the development worker comes in and says, we're going to grow tomatoes and zucchini. So you always, from the ground up perspective, you always have to ask, are we growing tomatoes for hippos? You always have to ask that question. Okay, so we talked quite a lot now, and the day is advancing, and I reckon it's 20 to 2, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that what we're going to do now is we're going to go for another break, and in this conversation, so we've said that your essential architecture that is needed for this project. We're going to leave the kind of community work because we kind of dealt with that yesterday. But the essential architecture that you need is you need internal hubs inside the GP practices. You need admin support. You need nurse time. You need doctor time. I've given you a very rough guide that you need about 0.5 admin support per head of population, per 10,000 of population. You need about 0.5 nurse time per 10,000 of population. You need about one session a week. You're probably looking at, in your practice, something like one session in each of the 5 practices devoted to helping run this project of GP time, which may mean you need to employ more GPs. But you're going to look for funding for that, because that's part of your funding bid. What we have to do is you want to work out what it is you need to be able to do this project to cost it up. So you're not going to go, we can't afford that, because we're going to apply for it with grant money, and then what you're going to do is you're going to demonstrate how much better, how much less medical usage there is as a consequence of implementing this change in the way that you do things. So, admin, go on.
Can I just ask, do you think many of the practices we work many doctors in each practice?
You work?
Many doctors in each.
Okay.
4 or 5 or.
Okay.
Do you think if one of the doctors is more heavily engaged in this project, do you think that's enough? If one doctor is heavily engaged and then trying to.
So if you're trying to get behaviour change, if you're trying to, you know that you need to influence all of the doctors. You can't leave people out. You can't say, oh, you can do it, but you can't do it. It doesn't work. What is the best way of getting behaviour change in doctors? Who do doctors listen to? Doctors. Everyone knows it. Doctors ignore everyone, and they even sometimes ignore other doctors. But if other doctors haven't done this and get it and understand it and can see that working lives are better, you don't stand a hope in hell. So what you want is for every practice to have at least one doctor who is heavily engaged in this project, because they will be the people that will influence the other doctors. That's
because there need to be some changes to get all of them involved, kind of.
Now you're coming up with ideas.
They need to see some positive, that it gives me a new way of working.
Yes.
Maybe a little bit more time, maybe more like possibilities to
Yes.
do this. Because if the resources gets up,
That's
there's
it.
kind of a hope to get changes.
That's it. So you have more people with a wider variety of people involved, and you're building your experience through changing the working practices in your own practice, which only you can do. And as your life gets better, you influence the other doctors in the practice.
And what was the reason why the doctors in the community maintain participate in this change?
Say that again.
Yes. Why did the doctors? What did make them willing to change? And what was it?
Yeah.
To achieve for themselves because it
Yeah.
the benefit.
Okay, it's a great question.
We are simple. We want benefits and we want to.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll tell you the story of how all this started. So there's a funny thing about stories, because we think stories are not that important. We don't pay that much attention to them. But stories are absolutely critical, and they're how we learn. In fact, so much so that if we don't hear stories, we don't even learn. It's hard for us to learn without stories, which is why I always tell lots of stories. So Helen was the lead GP who came up with all of this stuff. And Helen worked in a small single-handed or 3,000 patients in this area just outside of Frome. And so what happened was that the GP practices all moved in together in Frome. There's only one GP practice in Frome for 30,000 people. And Helen liked the working practices of the small practice, because she, like you were saying, she knew all the patients. So 3,000 people, you know everyone there. She went, oh God, you know, how are we going to maintain that sense of knowing about the individual people when it's for 30,000 people? And so she said, okay, what we'll do is I know that medicine is so much more than just giving people pills. So we definitely want medicine to happen in the context of people's lives. And she knew Jenny, so she said, we'll get Jenny involved in this, because Jenny does community development and she can connect all the stuff that's going on in the community with the practice. And then, if we're going to do that, we need some admin time. It's a good idea to ring people after they've been discharged from the hospital. And we want to make sure that we don't, the hospitals are a nightmare, the discharges are a nightmare, it's terrible. They often go wrong, they discharge people home inappropriately, they have to be readmitted. Why don't we I tell you what we'll do is we'll hire a nurse who works in the hospital but comes to the multidisciplinary meeting and makes connections with Jenny's team, the Health Connections Mendit team, so that we can have proper discussions about people. And we'll hold a weekly multidisciplinary team meeting where we discuss all the complex patients, just so that we can, it's common sense. And that's the hilarious thing about Helen, because she's very quiet person, and just kind of common sense. But that common sense is so powerful that she manages to persuade other people to do stuff. And so she changed the practice, and she thought, how are we going to get funding for this? So she kind of scratched around and got bits of funding, and we went through this horrible process of applying for funding every year. It's a nightmare, because people's jobs are dependent on it. And we knew that great things were happening. And then we thought that, let's write a paper, because if we provide the evidence that maybe what we're doing is good, maybe it's effective, just give the evidence and everyone will be really happy and everyone will just clap their hands and things will change. And so Helen wrote a paper, and because of work I was doing previously, I thought, well, we can probably get better data than the data we've got here. And I asked some people to give me the data, and they gave me the data. They were nuts. They shouldn't have given me the data, but they did. And I looked at the data, and it was a spreadsheet of 150,000 data items, but I knew how to handle that. I got a pivot table up, and I thought, what's happening to the emergency admissions? And I looked at the emergency admissions, and what came up was, and we were dumbfounded. We couldn't believe it. It's like, I knew that this had never happened before. And the picture comes into view and you see that all of the bits come together. So it's about how you build the team, how you influence people, how you get the right structure in place, something like that. And it comes from, the whole thing is built on inspiration. All right, so, you know, what I would, the success of this day will depend on how inspired you feel at the end of it. And if you don't feel inspired, I just really haven't done my job. I did the best I could, but it wasn't good enough. Because what you want is for you to come out of here and you need to be buzzing with these ideas and really feel like, I'm going to overcome the stinking obstacles of administration so that I can do this.
Just wondering, if you reflect back on the time you spent working on this project, thinking back, how hard work was it to convince people to do this?
So the story goes on.
Yeah. So the reason I'm asking is, like 11 years ago, I started working with this employment or work rehabilitation program for people with schizophrenia. And I recognise a lot of the things you say. You know, we travelled around the countryside. We got huge amounts of funding, and I don't know how many clinics I visited. Felt like a missionary, and everywhere the answer is, this is really, really interesting, but you know, my patients are very, very sick.
Yeah.
And like, but how we got a bit of momentum was that we had some success stories, and mental health professionals could see that, wow, this actually works. And then that started a bit of the snowball rolling, and it was, we got quite a lot of media coverage, and we got some of the success stories on TV and interviewed by the Prime Minister and this and that. But still to this day, it's like I still meet people who say, schizophrenia, that's a lifelong chronic condition. They need to get disability pension straight away. It's heartbreaking.
So I love that story. It's a very similar story. And so what happened was we produced this paper and we thought, that's it, we've done it. And we took this paper and we knew how to implement the model, and we went to the commissioning body for the rest of Somerset. And we said, look at this, and we'll do it for the whole of Somerset for you. We could save you, you know, in your budget of £700 million, which is, you know, 7 billion kroner, something like that. That we could save 5% of your budget just on the emergency admissions by implementing this model. It's fantastic. We know how to do it. And they went, no. and then the next thing that happened was, so the funding cycle happens in, you're supposed to put the plans in place by November, so when the new financial year comes in April, all the funding is in place. And we got this information out in June. And come November, they hadn't made a funding decision. And by February time, they still hadn't made a funding decision. And we know that we have to start laying people off because there isn't the funding for them to continue in the next year. So the next thing we did was I wrote an article along with a friend in a magazine called Resurgence. It's only got a circulation of 7,000 people or so.
That was the one I read.
That's it.
That's where it started.
Yeah. It was good enough to... So we wrote that article, and there's a Guardian journalist called George Monbiot who had written about a similar subject in the previous edition of Resurgence. So we wrote to George and said, George, write an article on this, and he did, amazingly. And he put this article in the Guardian called and he called it The Town That Cured Loneliness. And it was before the academic paper came out. That was still another year away. And there's a story about the academic paper as well, actually. And from George's article, we got worldwide coverage. It was amazing. We had people from all over the world come and visit. And then we started getting policy advisors from number 10 Downing Street, and policy advisors from the head of the NHS, and the medical director of NHS England. And sure enough, in April, there was no funds, and we laid people off. And it got to June. And one day, Helen gets a phone call from the Prime Minister's office and says, Helen, we've given you a Point of Light award, and can you come up to Downing Street tomorrow to pick up the award? So Helen goes, yeah, that'd be great. And she rings a commissioning body to say, oh, and by the way, I'm just letting you know I'm going to pick up an award from Theresa May tomorrow. And that evening, they ring and say, your funding has been granted. So the story you tell is absolutely right. Is that it's very, very difficult to persuade people, which is why you start it from the ground up, which is why you start it by, it's why we say you have to improve working lives, because you want the word of mouth spread to influence people. And I will tell you something else about word of mouth spread. So one of the things that we've done in Froome is we got community connectors. Community connectors are activated citizens. They're not volunteers. They're people who know about all the stuff that's on the web directory of resources, all the things that are going on in the community. They know about the Talking Cafe. They know about Jenny and her team with Health Connections Mendip, and it just means that when they're going through their daily lives, they can have conversations with people as they come across them about what's going on. And we know that health connectors will have conversations approximately 20 times a year about stuff that's going on in the community, more or less. And so 20 conversations, and who can be a health connector? Well, you think about who do you have conversations with about, where you're kind of talking about your life, and you have conversations with a whole load of people. Hairdressers particularly, not men so much, but cafe owners, drug and alcohol support workers, volunteer drivers, young mums group, job centre staff, policemen, places of worship. 20 conversations a year, 20 little kind conversations just about being a helpful human being. So far in Froome, we've trained 700 people in a town of 28,000 people. 14,000 compassionate conversations a year in a town of 28,000 people. Word of mouth is the most effective way of spreading news that you have. How on earth can you imagine reaching every member of your community within a 2-year period in a way that they notice? That's not a leaflet through a door that they ignore. That's not another email that irritates the hell out of them. That's not a marketing advert in their jamming up their spam box, or their yet another thing that when they go to a website they see this advert flash up. It's word of mouth. Word of mouth. It's the trust. It's that all of the body language that comes through the communication you have through face-to-face communication with people. And that's why you need to have a GP in every practice, so that you can be saying, oh my God, This is why I went into medicine, because that's what we have GPs saying when they participate in all of this, and that's much more effective than any of the other ways of persuading people to do things. And in fact, what we've done is that we're now, for centres who are interested in doing this work, we kind of done it through a mentoring program, and we kind of nudged people into it, but it's too difficult for people to get their head around what are all the changes that are needed. So now we run a training course for a group, for a team of people who want to implement this, because people need to understand it in their bones. You have to be able to have a group of people who, the power of one person, any old hippies in here? I'm probably the only person who's old enough to be an old hippie. There's a fantastic record called Alice's Restaurant. Anyone listen to Alice's Restaurant? It's by Arlo Guthrie, who is the son of Woody Guthrie, who's a well-known folks. You know, you've heard about Woody Guthrie, okay? And he's talking about Alice's Restaurant, and it's a really funny story. It's worth listening to if you get a chance. I'm sure it's on Spotify. Very funny, and the kind of central part of it is that gets everyone to sing these two lines of Alice's Restaurant. And he said that what we should do is that we should just have people going into the recruiting station for people who are for joining up to Vietnam, and they just sing the two lines of the song. And he said if one person does it, that one person is a lone nut. But if two people do it, you start to ask questions about what's going on. And when 10 people do it, you know it's a social movement. And so that's the way that you kind of bring around this change, is where you have a group of people together who are really driving the change, who feel deeply committed and inspired by it. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, we've got an hour left, and I think I'll tell you what I'll do is why don't I just write a slide, and then you can take a picture of a slide and take it with you, and I'll just put a slide in of the very basic architecture. I have got that slide somewhere, but I'll just very quickly do it now. Only take you 2 ticks. Oh, cool. MDM is multidisciplinary team meeting. Okay, so that's the basic architecture. If you now go back to your groups, drink coffee, eat cake, which we know is the most important activity, and take a photo of that so you can take it with you, and then start discussing about how you might implement that into what you're already doing. And we'll meet back here in half an hour. There's 2 or 3 groups, and we'll hear about your ideas about what this might look like for you.
MDM is
multidisciplinary team meeting. No, do you want me to write that out?
yeah.